So a year ago, I remember I was heading up to the Hill, or heading back from the Hill from a hearing. It was the Senate Armed Services Cybersecurity hearing. It was the infamous Rob Joyce empty chair hearing, if anybody remembers that. And I remember driving past the Mellon Auditorium and seeing the Cyber Week signs and remembering that Jeanette Manfra, the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, was going to be speaking. And I set a goal. I said, I'm going to be on that stage next year. I'm going to be there. So thank you, Goldie, for allowing me this opportunity. The way I like thinking about these things, this is apparently the end of the summer of strategies. In addition to the national strategy and the DoD strategy, DHS released a strategy earlier this year. There's been a whole host of others: the biodefense strategy, the EMP, electromagnetic pulse strategy, all bunch of strategies. And the DHS strategy really kind of works around five pillars. First is identify risk, and that's an important element that I'll come back to a couple times. The second is reduce vulnerabilities. The third is reduce threats. The fourth is mitigate consequences. And the final is enable a more effective cybersecurity ecosystem. So what does that all mean? Now, before unpacking that, which probably means given time I won't unpack all that, but let me tell you the way I think about the world right now and the way I think about DHS in particular. And to do that, I like kind of working through where we've been to get to where we are, to inform where we're going. And some of this is technical, but a lot of it's psychological as well. And so hop into the time machine with me, and let's go back to 1957. The Russians launched Sputnik into low Earth orbit, beating the United States to space. Not just in terms of putting the satellite up there, but actually doing it quite a bit bigger than we would have done it. It was a much heavier satellite than we were contemplating at the time. So what that did is a couple things. One, the realization, I think, dawned that we had been beaten in what we thought was where we had a technological advantage. What happened as a result? ARPA, DARPA, ARPANET, the internet. We regained that technological advantage. That's the technical piece. What was the psychological piece? Well, in addition to that realization that we weren't, the big dog in the neighborhood, there was also an undermining and confidence of a lot of the almost truisms that we had at the time. And one is the geographical distance, the two oceans on either side of the United States, were an effective deterrent against nation-state aggression. It takes time to move an army. In navies, the same you can see coming. But the Russians had developed an intercontinental ballistic missile capability to put that satellite in space, but also reach out and touch us in short order. So that undermined that sanctity of geographical distance, that we could be touched easily by a nation state. So fast forward to 2001, September 11th. There was a highly coordinated attack, 4 different places: New York, here in DC, Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And once again, we are caught in a bit of a position where we were outstripped by our adversaries. This time, in the intervening 10 years of the collapse of the Soviet Union, it wasn't a nation state. Instead, it was a terrorist threat. If you look back at the 9/11 Commission, there were 4 failures. One was imagination. One was capabilities. Capabilities was intelligence. There was intelligence. It just wasn't effectively stitched together. What was the result technically? Well, we developed the Department of Homeland Security to lead the nation's efforts to lead and coordinate the nation's efforts to counter attacks by terrorists. The psychological impact was perhaps we're not safe once again over here because our adversaries are using our infrastructure against us. So the Department of Homeland Security was established. My organization was established initially primarily as a physical security organization. Cybersecurity at the time was a very small piece of the pie, and in the stories I've heard in the development of the legislation, there was a bit of a fight on cybersecurity and whether it actually deserved a role just in general, given the understanding of the threat profile. So the department was established, my organization established, and that brings us forward to 2016. 2016, about this time last year, maybe a little bit earlier, the Russians attempted and in some cases interfered with our presidential election, particularly on the social media side. That was a 3-part, well-coordinated campaign attempting to hack into our nation's election infrastructure, the voting systems. One is the hacking and leaking across political campaigns, and the third is this information operation. So once again, we're in a position where we had intelligence, we were trying to stitch together the response, but we didn't have the relationships to effectively respond and defend, in particular, our election infrastructure. The relationships with state and local election officials, secretaries of state, did not exist in 2016. It does now. You'll hear a little bit later from Matt Masterson, who's one of our cybersecurity experts in the election space, on a panel later today. So that brings us to the point of what do we do about it? So today, the Department of Homeland Security, let me roll back one quick second. So again, 2016, the election interference, it was a galvanizing moment, not just inside government, but also across the American people, because prior to that, maybe I think most in this room realized the significance, importance of cybersecurity, but I think it finally dawned on the American people that perhaps cybersecurity was not just intellectual property theft. It was not just cyber crime. It was not just PII harvesting. It was a vector, it was a threat that could directly undermine our way of life in our constitutional republic. That was unsettling, much like Sputnik was unsettling, much like 9/11 was unsettling. So again, bringing us today, my organization stands on the cusp, pending one last legislative action, of becoming the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency that will be responsible, much like the department when it was stood up in 2003, to coordinate the nation's efforts to counter the terrorist threat. My organization will be responsible for leading and coordinating the nation's efforts to defend against attacks today and secure against threats tomorrow. And that has become, within my team, kind of the organizing concept, defending today and securing tomorrow. This summer, we had an event up in New York City, the DHS National Cybersecurity Summit. We had a host of both private sector and government luminaries, Secretary Perry from DOE, General Nakasone from the NSA, Director Wright from the FBI. We're all up in New York working alongside private sector partners. At the same event, the Secretary announced the establishment, which in effect was actually a elevation of an organization within my team now called the National Risk Management Center. And there was a degree of what's that all about? There were some questions about what are you trying to do here? And I was taking the approach here as we developed this of more of a startup culture. Let's get this thing going. Let's kind of take a spiral development approach, get some wins, build success, and continue to build collaboration for future opportunities. The concept here is consistent with defending today and securing tomorrow. We have to take advantage of the information and the intelligence we have, as Suzette was talking about, protecting networks, getting better security partnerships within government, shared services. We have to do things today to defend our networks, but we also have to be thinking down the road of what the next infrastructure deployment looks like. How do we get IoT into a better space in the next couple years? So that's our organizing principle, defending today, securing tomorrow. The National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center is that steady state 24/7 incident response capability, malware analysis capability, indicators of compromise sharing capability. Over the last year, we've issued a number of technical alerts, starting last summer, Russian activities against critical infrastructure. We saw them targeting energy, aviation, construction. Sent out a technical alert last year, followed it up with another one in the spring. It's important to realize that these technical alerts are not fully baked by the federal government. What we do is we take technical alerts, we share with partners, both in the federal government and out in industry, to light up these campaigns. The intelligence community has a small slice of the information economy in terms of cybersecurity. I think we all know that. And then we share it out with partners that can light up where they see the additional information. And that leads to a series of technical alerts that build on prior work. So last summer, we issued, as I mentioned, the critical infrastructure technical alert. Earlier this year, we issued a technical alert alongside the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, as well as our partners in the National Cybersecurity Center in the United Kingdom. This one was Russian activity, Russians again, targeting network infrastructure devices, sharing indicators of concern, behavior, TTPs, of activities that we had seen on networks. Again, the idea here of these alerts, push it out, enable network defenders to protect their networks in the hope, ultimately, that there's almost a full duplex information sharing. When we send an alert out, what we want is folks to send what they see back into us so we can continue to build out the picture, build out the campaign, that then leads into some of those activities that Grant mentioned about a deterrence package, about how we defend over there. This is a two-part game, defense, and offense. So we issued another one just recently. This was a technical alert focusing on an advanced persistent threat, conducting cyber espionage and intellectual property theft, using and exploiting vulnerabilities in managed service providers to jump in and out of customers, living off the LAN, scraping, and bringing it back up into the MSP. So not just IOCs and TTPs of the adversary, but also the right conversations that organizations should be having with their managed service providers, their cloud providers. As we accelerate into the cloud, are we asking the right questions about security, transparency, and the right controls? So this brings a full circle around our priorities. Suzette talked about our work on federal networks. Just yesterday was the anniversary of one of the binding operational directives we issued on email security and web security, the DMARC binding operational directive. We're also just past a one-year anniversary of our Kaspersky Labs binding operational directive, which in my view was one of the most significant directives that we've issued. It was recognition of a direct threat in an untenable risk management posture across the federal government, but we also recognize that chief information security officers take alerts issued or operational directives issued by the federal government, DHS in particular, and they use those to make organizational decisions. If they needed to get off KL and move somewhere else, they can use that BOD. We recognize that. Talked a little bit about the critical infrastructure partnership and the work we're doing there. And the last thing, this is the space where I see we have the most opportunity in front of us right now, particularly as we make this shift into the binding, into CISA, or the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. The Brits do this well. I spent some time in London this summer with my counterpart, and really was taken by how they communicate, how effectively and clearly non-governmentese or bureaucratically with the general public. That's the space that I think DHS and my organization has the most room in front of us. And it's not necessarily, it is in part just the general protection or cybersecurity measures with months like Cybersecurity Month, but it's to get to that small and medium-sized business. They don't necessarily have the full capabilities that the larger organizations do, the more sophisticated. So if we can communicate clearly at home, we'll be able to get that small and medium-sized business cohort as well. Before I wrap up here, one last reminder. DHS is in the lead for federal government in support of state and local governments on election security efforts. Matt Masterson, as I mentioned, will talk about it today. We're not seeing activity right now, particularly anything close on the direct election hacking of election infrastructure. We're not seeing anything right now along the lines of 2016. And that, frankly, makes me a little nervous. So if we're not seeing any activity and we're less than 3 weeks out, what does that mean? I have a paranoid dispositionist anyway, so I continue to work through what can we do. I don't want to have another failure of intelligence, and I don't want to, most importantly, have another failure of imagination. So we're working aggressively right now with our partners in state and locals to work through what could an adversary do in the 3 weeks or the 2.5 week lead up to the midterm elections. Yes, the midterm is not the big game. The big game, we think, for the adversary is probably 2020. 18 is just the warm-up or the exhibition game, but nonetheless, we're going to be ready. We've been working around the clock for over a year now with our state and local partners. We made significant progress. I have confidence that this election will be significantly more secure, but most importantly, more resilient than 2016. So what can you do? Go home today. Check your voter registration. Check, make sure you know where you are registered to vote, or the precinct you will vote at. Make sure you understand the identification requirements. Know your rights as a voter. If something goes wrong, something always goes wrong on election day, whether it's weather, whether it's a technical glitch, whether it's a car hitting a light pole and knocking out power to a precinct. Something bad happens. Election directors are risk managers. They have plans in place. There are federal laws that support your rights as a voter. Make sure you know what your rights are, including provisional ballots. If something goes wrong and you're not on that list, whether it's a nefarious act or something else, know that you have the right to request a provisional ballot. Every state's a little bit different. Check it out. Go to the Secretary of State's office. Also, social media, be very careful what you read. Validate with a third source. But again, if you have questions about elections, go to the Secretary of State or the Chief Election Official's office. Validate, verify, go to the root source. So with that, I got to go catch a plane. Thank you very much.